Hello and welcome to Epicentre. No ambiguity, no noise. Let's come straight to the point. If you've been following the headlines about Indian Americans in the United States in recent past, you would have come across a new set of headlines that have hit most media websites or newspapers. Gone are the days of, well, maybe not gone, but what has taken precedence over the days of Apu stereotypes or other stereotypes like Indian mothers going into permanent depression if the kid scores a B in a class, or making fun of Hindu gods and deities and the way of Hindu worship. Those days seem to be in past. Now the new kid in the town is caste. It's being assumed that all Hindu Americans are castes or indulge in caste discrimination as a matter of fact or as someone who they are. And therefore now a lot of people will, in op-ed columns and in the activist mode, they will tell you that there needs to be a legislation that needs to fix this. I don't know how this is different from assuming that all members of a particular community are predisposed to crime, and hence now a community-specific legislation needs to be brought about. Instead of focusing on the individual cases of discrimination, what we are doing is, what these activists would like to do is that they would like to assume everybody is guilty, and now people have to go and prove that they aren't guilty. This turns American jurisprudence on its head, because now we are assuming guilt before the crime is even proven. To talk about all this, I'm delighted to have with me a very strong voice who has been fighting all this, and her name is Suhag Shukla. You must have seen her on your television networks. She has been talking about it incessantly. She has been writing columns about it. She is a one-person army, but my team has given me a whole bio about Suhag, so I will read a few bits about that. Says Suhag Shukla is executive director and co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She is applauded for her work directed towards the promotion of civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. Suhag is a member of the board for the National Museum of American Religion and has served on religious advisory committees for the Council of Foreign Relations and Humane Society of the United States. She's closely associated with the First Amendment Center's Committee on Religious Liberty and the United Nations Women's Gender Equality and Religion Platform. The Center for American Progress named Suhag Shukla as one of the 12 faith leaders to watch in 2017, and there is a whole page, but I'm going to chuck it, and I'm just going to say that I have known Suhag for a while now, and both of us have often found ourselves on the same side of the debate. I have been watching her, and let me tell you that she has, what I admire the most about her is her focus and her clarity of thought. She can stay focused on the battle that is ahead. And and this is important because the battles she is fighting, most people, what they try to do is that they try to make it so complicated and so convoluted on purpose. So if you don't keep the focus on the right thing, you could totally get lost. So Suhag has been doing that on behalf of Indian American community in the United States. Suhag, welcome to Epicentre.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. I would just add one minor connection that I'm not a one-person army. I'm actually very fortunate to have an amazing team of staff and board members and volunteers, and of course your supporters at the Hindu American Foundation.
Yes.
This job is not easy, and you have to have, your quote unquote village to be supporting you, to ensuring that you're doing the right thing, that you have the best arguments. So I consider myself blessed.
Absolutely. And we are going to talk about Hindu American Foundation, the foundation that you are executive director of and helped found. We're going to talk about that because it's very important that we understand what this organization does, because even though you have it all written on your website, but most people don't seem to understand what you do. So it's very important that we talk about it. But before that, Suhag, for the benefit of my audience, you are a second generation Indian American. You were born and raised in the United States. Tell me a little bit about what is it to grow as a Hindu, to be raised as a Hindu in the United States. And then, of course, when the tables turn and you are a parent, what is it to raise Hindu children? To see what is the difference?
Well, I was born and raised, as you said, in the United States. My father came here in the 60s after the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act, which had blocked immigration from large swaths of Asia, as the name of that bill or act suggests. And so I am part of that kind of early growth of the Indian American community. Now, of course, there were Indians who came here in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Some of them were kind of at the forefront of civil rights cases in which the United States was grappling with whether to allow offering citizenship to people of Indian origin, people of Japanese origin. But then there's like a huge blank in our history as a community. And so my father came here to pursue better opportunities, to pursue the American dream. But, many of them who came, I think, had intentions of returning. And it's interesting how politics and immigration policy and all of these things really begin shaping our experience as we think we're making these decisions. But there's always larger movements that have obviously impacted the directions of our lives. So for a lot of those people who came in the 60s, when the time for them to return would have been where they, gained a little bit of job experience and wanted to return home, quote unquote, that was in the throes of the emergency. Not the best time to return to India, where there was such authoritarian rule, to maybe start a business, or, especially if you were not accustomed to having to pay bribes for getting anything done. And so that kind of sparked, I think, a huge growth in the Indian American community. When I grew up in California, today it's a bastion of, diverse faces, a lot of Indian faces. But when I was growing up, I actually did not go to a temple until maybe the age of 5 or 6. The Hindu tradition was very much alive in our homes. I was fortunate to live in an extended family. My grandmother lived with us, and my maternal grandparents would visit very often and stay long periods of time. And so that was really a part of my formation. Over time, my family supported my aunts and uncles and everyone else to come. So now I have a family that expands to about 150 members, largely in the San Francisco Bay Area, but very few left in India. So, that was kind of the formation. It was not unusual to be the only person of Indian origin, the only person who is Hindu in a classroom. I can count on maybe just 2 hands, the number of people of Indian origin who graduated from my high school class. Now that high school is probably 40% Asian, a large number of whom are of Indian origin. So it was very different. I would credit my parents. We grow up with these stories, but I think part of the American experience is this independent streak.
Yeah.
And, not being like asking questions kind of questioning authority, so to speak. And when I did that, my parents, rather than just turning to, no, well, this is the way we've always done things, they actually had the humility to recognize the fact that they didn't necessarily have the answers to what I was asking, because for them it was tradition. It was kind of the ethos that they had been immersed in. And so there was no reason to question. They weren't necessarily coming to heads with people from outside the community who would ask, well, why do you do this? What do you believe in? And so that encouraged them to turn to their kind of community elders to say, hey, what do we do with this one? You know, she's rebellious. She's asking all these questions that we don't know. And we don't want her to turn her back on this tradition, because it's given us so much meaning and so much purpose, and it's allowed us to lead a positive, selfless life. So that that conversation led to them entering me into Chinmaya mission, where I started exploring our sacred texts. One of the first classes that I entered, I'm all the way in 8th grade already, was the Bal Vihar, and we were discussing the Bhagavad Gita, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much more to the rituals that I'm seeing my grandmother do every day religiously. And that sparked a lifelong reverence and curiosity for our tradition. And once I was able to recognize what our tradition is and what the meaning behind all the things that I was seeing, whether it's just little things like, my parents welcoming guests into the home, and treating them with such hospitality, Atithi Devo Bhava, to make that connection, that's what Bal Vihar did for me. And knowing all of that, when I came to heads with stereotypes in my 9th grade world history class, or then I went ahead and pursued a degree in religion as my undergraduate studies, I became acutely aware of the disconnect between what we know our tradition to be and what it is, and what the mainstream thinks of it.
Yeah. A shout out to Chinmaya Mission for sure. I think they are leaders in Hindu education today, and I couldn't be more thankful. I didn't have the opportunity of going to Bal Vihar as a child. I didn't grow up in United States. I grew up in India, but I am acutely aware of what Bal Vihar has done for many, many, many children, not just in the United States, but everywhere else. Yeah. So a big shout out to them. So how you talked about being the only child sometimes in your school and all that. Your life took a different turn than what most Indian Americans expect their children to do. So you got your undergraduate degree in religion, and then you went to law school, and you are a lawyer by training. And after that, you decide to invent this whole troublesome situation for yourself and be in permanent trouble. And so you decide to go into advocacy. How was that? Was that considered a rebellious thing? Because before that, and the reason I ask you that, because it's not just a personal decision, first generation immigrants typically tend to put their head down, work towards their thing, because everything is so new for them. So they're not, especially when people who had come in 60s, they just put their blinkers on, and full credit to them for raising the kids they did, but they just didn't want to deal with what was going outside. So if there was an instance of, say, discrimination or racism, they would just brush it aside, and they would say, my job right now is to make a house, earn a family, raise my family, and I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to forget about it. Yeah. This doesn't happen in second generation then, because by that time you already have feet in the ground, and you think you have a voice and you can raise it, and you do know your rights much better than the first generation does. However, in second generation also, amongst the Indians, at least Indian origin, advocacy was not a career of choice. Mm-hmm. How did you end up here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think, my parents took the biggest risk. They left everything they knew. I think they kind of taxed. It's like a sprint. they did this such an intense sprint. If you equate risk with sprints of leaving everything they knew, leaving their family and coming to this country. And at that point, they're like, okay, that's it. I did it. It was in my bucket list. I took the biggest risk of my life, and that's it. No more. So, that's kind of, I think, and I mean, generally speaking, I think our community is risk averse, and I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist to try to understand what, there's so many factors that might have contributed to that risk aversion, historical reasons. But I will say that even in pursuing law school, I distinctly remember, the Indian professors in Gainesville, Florida. I was at the University of Florida. They had, the community had come together and said, let's create a job fair. And so then they had, engineering professors there and med school professors there. And then everyone kind of dispersed. They're like, okay, well, engineering is here, accounting is here, and medical school is there. There was actually no one from the law school. So everyone dispersed, and I kind of looked around and I was by myself. So even just pursuing law school, there weren't that many of us pursuing law school. When I graduated, the first job that I took was with legal aid. I was always I know it's a kind of a loaded term today, but I mean it in the truest meaning of it. But I was always social justice oriented. I wanted to live a life of service. And so I accepted a job at Legal Aid. I was a homeless advocate. I worked with victims of domestic violence who had left their homes. I worked with people who had been illegally evicted. And my paycheck, I remember when I got the job offer and brought it home and showed my dad, I was so happy. He's like, you could probably make more like bagging groceries at the local Publix. That's not.
You didn't need to go to school for all this. Get a bachelor's and a professional degree.
Exactly. And even when I pursued when I said I wanted to, I started as an accounting major, and then literally bombed out. I hated accounting. No offense to accountants. I really depend on our accountants now with HAF's books, but it was not a good fit for me. But I was taking religion courses, and I came home and I said, you know what? I'm sorry, Papa, Mommy, I just can't do this. I want to pursue a degree in religion. So my father said, okay, fine, but you need to also have a practical degree. And so that's why I have an economics degree as well. I don't know how practical really that would have been back then. I still would have had to pursue a master's or PhD in economics to be employable. However, those were the kind of conversations that were going on in my family. So after I graduated from law school, I became a homeless advocate, did that for 2-3 years. And then I had my first child, and that my job was kind of keeping me on the road. And, you asked me earlier about raising Hindu American children. Just to go back to that question, and then I'll return to this one. I thought it would be a lot easier in the sense that my children wouldn't face the struggles that I did, of all the questions, of all the stereotypes and things like that. But it's actually gotten worse in some sense. To the what you said in the introduction, the types of negative headlines that come out about Indian Americans and Hindus. So and the same stereotypes that we faced, yes, we've been working on making them better, especially those that are entrenched in textbooks, but they're still there. So that was kind of a surprise for me. But anyways, going to pursuing this, I had started getting activated on college campus, on our college campus with our Indian Student Association, and started noticing some kind of hypocrisies. So for our Diwali function, if we wanted to light a diya, some of the students and even faculty would say, well, no, we need to keep this cultural and not religious. It was Diwali. It's in the word. Like, how do you not light a diya? And, when I was vice president, I said, look, why can't we not be true to this? Yes, have fun, make it cultural, but we can also, put a nod to the sacred aspects of this festival. And at the same time, we have enough money. And even though maybe Muslim and Christian students made up a very small percentage of our Indian Student Association, let's host a Eid, let's host a Christmas party. But when I brought that up, everyone's like, well, no, we have limited finances and, we shouldn't do it. So, it was kind of this performative inclusion in that, okay, okay, let's just, rather than actually being inclusive, why don't you just hold back? You're bringing your full self to the table. And so by the time I was in law school, Hindu student organizations were starting to pop up all over the country. And some undergraduate students were trying to start a Hindu student group on campus, the Hindu Student Council. And they came to heads with faculty who said, we don't want this on campus. We already have the Indian Student Association. They couldn't really answer. So then they had me come in. I thought, wow, I'm a first-year law school. I'm going to go defend them. But I've always been a good arguer, I suppose. I think my family members can vouch for that. When I questioned some of these faculty members that, why don't you oppose the Muslim Student Association? Why don't you oppose Hillel? Why don't you oppose the Baptist, the Episcopalian, the Anglican, and every Methodist, Presbyterian, all those other Christian associations on campus where Indian students who were from those faiths could be part of ISA, but then they could also have their spiritual needs met. So these things were already kind of planted. One of the co-founders of HAF happens to be my better half, Suhag Shukla, and a classmate of mine, Nikhil Joshi. And we all ended up living in Tampa after we graduated from graduate school. Nikhil had just joined a labor and employment firm. Asim was doing his residency, and we were beginning to kind of feel a void, like, well, what do we do? How do we channel this energy when we see these kind of hypocrisies around us? And so it was letters to the editor and discussions. Meanwhile, all the way in California, Mihir Meghani is kind of having some of those same thoughts and conversations. And he said, look, we've got to look to other communities like the Jewish community or the Buddhist community to see how they're facing the same challenges. They're facing accusations of dual loyalty. They're facing, issues of misrepresentation, and, trying to speak out on current issues, bringing in their own perspectives. How do we do that? And through his conversations with other organizations from other faith communities, he kind of landed on this idea of professionalizing. We need to have an organization that has a professionalized staff that brings in the requisite training, builds the subject matter expertise, is able to kind of talk the talk and walk the walk in these spaces, whether it's a policy space, whether it's a legal space, whether it's a media space, to be able to build bridges, to shape our own narrative, and to advocate. And so, I was amongst those co-founders in starting the Hindu American Foundation. Little did I know that I would join staff. I honestly did not even have that on my radar.
This was 2003.
This was 2003. When we launched one of the first.
And before HAF, there was no Hindu advocacy group like that in the United States.
No, I mean,
you have the distinction of being the first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are going to hit 20 years in September. Yes. So that's exciting. But, in 2005, when we sued the State Board of Education in California, I did that in a volunteer capacity.
And you were just 2 years old. HAF was just 2 years old at that point.
Exactly. But, we were having conversations with other Hindu groups that had participated in the textbook reform process, and all of a sudden they were shut out. And what we realized is that, well, we have 2 lawyers on staff. We understand process. And I don't know that we had envisioned, legal advocacy in that sense of through impact litigation. We were already participating as amicus curiae in cases dealing with the separation of church and state. But that all happened on a volunteer basis. So probably, I always lose track of time, but we had already hired 2 or 3 staff members, but they were all being overseen by volunteer board. And I was not on the board. I always served as legal counsel because Asim was on the board. So, we wanted to be mindful of not having, a husband and wife. I think maybe there was an idea in the beginning that maybe we would be a voting bloc. Anyone who knows us know that Asim and I are on the same page when it comes to our ethics, but on our opinions, we're worlds apart. But anyways, so a couple years in, I had kind of I was volunteering for HAF probably, I don't know, 20, 30 hours a week. We had moved to Minnesota. I was studying for the bar. And I happened to have a conversation with Mihir. And he's like, well, you're studying for the bar. What's your plan? And I said, well, I'm going to go back into the service space and, see if there's a domestic violence shelter locally or some sort of kind of advocacy or service position that I can find. And then he said, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just work for HAF? And that is probably one of the most important conversations that I've had in my life because I am just so privileged to have my personal spiritual path, my passion, and my professional skills almost seem set up for what I've been able to do for the past, 15.
So I spent a little bit of time before this interview. I have been to your website before, HAF, and I spent some time looking at it this morning as well. And you very carefully, and I mean, very in no unambiguous words, tell the world what you are, a Hindu advocacy group. And then you have a FAQ section where you clearly say that, yes, we do the advocacy for Hindus primarily, but we also believe in human rights, we believe in equality, we believe in coexistence of everybody. So even if we talk about Hindu rights, this does not, even if we advocate for Hindu issues, this does not mean that we are against a community or against a group. You may be against on certain issues. You may be against somebody because there's always two sides of the coin, but that does not mean that you are blanketly,
right,
not pro some organization or some group. This is very clearly written. Why is HAF then routinely misunderstood? Why are the accusations like Hindutva American Foundation hurled on you? Why is it, and you talked about dual loyalty before, and that is exactly what you're fighting, but yet you are constantly being accused of dual loyalty. You're constantly being accused of speaking for a few people and not everyone. Why does that happen?
Yeah, I actually don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's an intentional misrepresentation. If it were a misunderstanding, then dialogue could, dialogue and reason would absolve.
Your dialogue is now 20 years of work.
Right, exactly, right? So I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's intentional. And it's sometimes politically motivated, sometimes it's ideologically motivated, and other times it's religiously motivated. In terms of those who either have a deep hatred towards Hinduism or are opposed to an ascending, strong Hindu voice. As far as, yes, we serve the Hindu American community, but as much as our service is oriented towards Hindu Americans, it's also rooted in our understanding of Hindu teachings and Dharma. And by its very nature, when you have a tradition that sees all of existence as inherently divine, there's no other way than to have to serve humanity. So, when we look, say, at our human rights portfolio and we speak out for Hindu minorities, the fact is that if there's no one who's speaking out for Hindu minorities, no one will know. But if Hindu minorities are suffering, then there's other people who are suffering. So in speaking out for one group, you are benefiting other groups. So this accusation, people want to, not only do people want to ignore some of the human rights atrocities faced by Hindus, they actually want to deny them. I was just at an event last night talking about the parallels between anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. And I shared how, we had created a microsite, I think in 2021 to celebrate survival 50 years after the Bengali Hindu genocide. Well, we were slapped with a notice by the Pakistan Internet Police, essentially. I mean, that's not their official name, but that's essentially what they are, to take the site down because it was hurting the sentiments of the Pakistani military or defaming the Pakistani military. Let's forget the fact that the Pakistani military was behind all the atrocities that led to millions of lives displaced, hundreds of thousands of women raped in rape camps, and millions killed, most of whom were Hindu. But we see not just the whitewashing of these things, but the denial of these types of genocide. So the reasons for wanting to fight us, in some sense, as much as it's frustrating, because it's almost like you're trying to forge ahead to do good work, but at the same time you have to kind of hold a shield back because there's people coming at you from all directions. But I think that's the problem, right? That they don't want the truth to come out. They don't want voices of reason. And I believe that Dharma innately forces you to be reasonable, to find, to balance competing interests. I mean, that's what all of our texts tell us to do. That's what all of the stories that we learn, whether it's Ram and the decisions that he has to make between, having Sita stay with him or worrying about what people are murmuring in the kingdom. I mean, these are competing interests, very difficult choices, but that's what Dharma always tells us, that you will be faced with competing rights. You will be faced with two solutions, one better than the other.
So what you're saying is the nature of the work will attract, the nature of the work that you do will attract this kind of opposition, and this isn't anything that you worry about because that is the nature of the beast. Because
Exactly.
if you're talking about people, then you're fair enough.
Yeah.
However, there are also accusations hurled about, especially in the time of election seasons and everything, that you are favoring, even though on the website you have completely clearly said that you do not support any, you're independent, you do not support any political parties, you may or may not support political, candidates, irrespective of left or right. But there is an accusation sometimes that comes around that HAF supports a few candidates and doesn't support another candidate. What is your understanding of why you would support a candidate when they stand for any election in the United States?
Well, first of all, we can't legally endorse a candidate.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot of folks kind of miss. And that's people from within our own community, right?
Yeah.
That's where those kind of critiques are coming. As a 501c3, we cannot endorse any political candidate.
Absolutely.
And on a very practical matter, though, are we willing to work with both Democrats and Republicans? Absolutely. Why? Because our community makes up 1.5% of this entire country. If, are there districts where maybe we can swing an election one way or the other? Sure, there might be. Or if they're not there yet, maybe at some point when the community galvanizes, we'll have that sort of power, because there are other communities of that size who have been able to swing elections. But the point here is that our challenges actually come from the fringes of both sides. And therefore, we have to work with the middle of both sides. Not only does Dharma kind of lead us to that solution, but it's also the practical solution, which I guess Dharma and practicality oftentimes need to align, right?
And also because if your major thing is Hindu advocacy, doesn't matter where the support comes from.
Exactly. And so I'll give you an example. So in some ways, if I, in a given week, if I get an accusation or a complaint that, HAF is too left-leaning. In that same week, I'm going to get accusations that, oh, HAF is too right-leaning. Well, to me, then that signals to me that we're probably doing our job right. Because when you're a nonpartisan, people should not be able to just place you. So I'll just give you some examples. Like when it comes to separation of church-state issues, say whether it's mandatory school prayer or those types of things, we definitely are going to find more partners on the left. It's just the nature of, here on the further right wing, you have more of an evangelical presence who would like to see more Christianity immersed into our public school systems. Well, that has a direct impact on Hindu American children. Now, if you live in New Jersey or California or one of the coasts, you may not think it's a big deal because your child might have another 10 classmates who are Hindu. And so they're going to have, some sort of network or community within which to still feel comfortable. But let's talk about, a child whose father is maybe or mother is a physician in a small town and in Alabama, in the Bible Belt, who may be the only person who's Hindu and of Indian origin. The law is going to apply to everyone. And so, that's a place, a good example of where we might be working more with, candidates or rather representatives who are on the left. But then when we look at, say, our human rights portfolio, something like the abrogation of Article 370 and all of the misinformation that was going out there, right, in terms of what was happening in India. Well, there's more elected representatives on the right who understand the challenge of terrorism and of national security. And so for an issue like that, or some of our human rights work, we're going to get more support from the right. So the nature of our issues are in some sense nonpartisan, or at least give us the opportunity to be bipartisan. And we have to be that way because to us, it's not about an ideology. It's about finding solutions. And
group, you cannot afford to be linked with one group, and that's the nature of who you are. I have to now, you've given me a segue into the debate that we are actually going to talk about today and in some detail. A few years ago, I work with media, as you well know, and when you sort of are in the news business, then more than the others, your antenna sort of rise when you see news headlines, and then you always try to see, is there a pattern? And my job is always looking at the patterns. Suddenly, about a few years ago, as I said in my introduction, we were talking about, usually it used to be either talking about elephant god and, in a very condescending manner where they were talking about us and for us, but in the same way, they would say Hindus pray to elephant god and, all kind of pagan things were attributed to us. So that was challenge of one kind, where you were trying to tell people that, or Hindu Americans were trying to tell people, this is our way of worship. This is a different way of worship, but it is our way of worship. So that's one kind of challenge. Another challenge that suddenly came about was this caste. This was unknown in India, even, let's say, unknown in the United States, even 10 years ago, and seven years ago. Suddenly, a few years ago, I saw the first thing that hit the headlines was Cisco, that Cisco case. And then there seemed to be, everything was almost in tandem, one after another headline, and one after another. Suddenly, Washington Post is doing a story. Suddenly, New York Times is doing a story. And they're asking for federal laws for caste to be considered as a category of discrimination. So do you think, I don't believe, in my job, I don't believe anything just comes up. I don't think these things are organic. Do you think there was an agenda behind this? Because Indian American community is just, as you said, 1.5%. Hindu Americans are even less. But they are a successful community. They are, wherever they go, they bring peace and prosperity, and they are good citizens. What is it that, that suddenly these caste allegations started coming up and stories started coming up? Suddenly these data points started coming up, and when you look at those data sets, they look flawed. They totally look flawed, but the headlines don't say that. And suddenly you are now talking about all Hindu Americans being casteist, and there needs to be a legislation for it. Tell me, where did this begin? Have you been able to go back and see where did this begin?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as an agenda, even though those champions of these very divisive and destructive and unconstitutional policies have gotten smarter, at its heart, it's an anti-Hindu agenda. Now they're, before, if you looked at some of the earlier iterations of the calls for caste policies, whether it was on college campuses, whether you read in detail the Cisco suit, it was all about this being a religious Hindu hierarchy. Over time, as HAF and other community organizations and the community have stood up to say, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing here? They've shifted, right? To first it was, well, no, it's not. This is not just targeting Hindus. This is Indians of all religious communities. And then even beyond Indians, now it's become South Asian. So, you can see that the target, in some sense, it seems on paper to be more broad, but at its root,
essentially Hindu.
Yeah, it's essentially Hindu. I think that it started before the caste policies. We saw this in textbook reform, where you have, whether it's academics and now more activists, coming forward and trying to conflate a hierarchical and oppressive caste system to equate that with or conflate it with the Hindu tradition. Now, this is a trope that's been around for several hundred years. It's a colonial trope that Hinduism imposes this pyramid with the priests on top and everyone, then the warriors. Everyone knows the simplistic reductive pyramid, in spite of the fact that historians, anthropologists, sociologists, Indologists all know that Indian society has never been organized in this manner. That you're looking at society, Indian society, that of course had its own divisions, no different from any other society. Indian society is not exceptional in that sense. However, this kind of narrative of a pyramid that's pan-Indian, meaning someone in Kashmir immediately is going to recognize the caste and the status of someone all the way in Kanyakumari, is the presumption. And so that is the type of reductive and inaccurate depiction of Indian society that many academic scholars, well, I don't want to call them academic scholars. Let me call them scholar activists. I even use the word scholar there very loosely. The irony is that these are scholars that, are against quote unquote white supremacy or colonialism, yet they're perpetuating colonial narratives about themselves. So, I think there's been scholars who have called this the colonized mind or colonial consciousness, and that's kind of what we are faced against, at least when it's coming from academia, and from the scholars, from the activist circles. It's largely kind of neo-Buddhist or Ambedkarite activists who have an obvious hatred for Hinduism, and that too, that hatred. I don't want to deny that people have faced discrimination, whether it's in India or whether it's here, but to root that in a religious tradition is inaccurate and it's wrong. And so, in terms of that root cause, I think that needs to be acknowledged. But
just let me stop you for 1 minute. In India, and I'm not conflating the two issues here, because I think these come from two different situations. But in India, usually a caste trope is perpetuated, usually by politicians. It is generally understood to cause divisions in Hindu society. This is understood as the politics in India. That's how it is to,
Right.
to divide a Hindu society, because a combined Hindu society, then it is one big monolith, and nobody likes that. There should be a unified Hindu society. That is in India.
Yeah.
Do you think that traveled here as well? Because some of those activists traveled here as well, and now they wanted to create divisions in Hindu Americans?
Right, right. No, I think so. Well, first, I want to just actually, we sometimes talk about caste, or we use this word as if everyone's talking about the same thing. But, even if you look historically at kind of the institutionalizing of caste through census exercises in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Even those British administrators who are the census takers are going out into the communities, and they're saying, well, these, dumb Indians don't even know what their caste is. Well, maybe they were asking the wrong question, right? Yeah. So caste becomes this kind of corporate or conglomerate term that that flattens all these diverse ways in which Indians or Indian society, self-organized, self-identified. And so we're oftentimes, people don't necessarily know what they're talking about. There's no agreed upon definition of.
Also, I was talking to a few political scientists, and they told me that it is so complicated, the whole caste thing, because a certain last name, for example, say Verma, would be one caste in one state and would be another caste in another state. A Chaudhary, for example, would be so-called upper caste in one state and OBC in another state. So it is so complicated, even in India. How is this going to, how are legislations now being sought to made on something that is so complicated and so complex, and no one is willing to even give it the kind of academic rigor that it requires?
Well, exactly. And even beyond the academic rigor, look, we've held from the beginning that this is not a question. Look, even one incident of caste-based discrimination is one too many in my book. And so the question is not whether we deal with caste discrimination, it's how we deal with it. But the statistics speak for themselves. The only authentic, or the study itself, I think, has issues as well, but it's the largest scale study done on Indian American social realities and attitudes. And I think more should be done. But in that, they found that, they interviewed, it was by the Carnegie Endowment, 1,000 Indian Americans were interviewed, or people of Indian origin in the United States, and half reported having faced some form of discrimination. 30% on the basis of color, 18% on the basis of gender, 18% on religion, 1% on national origin. Now, there was a branch off, and even though everyone would agree that these quote unquote caste identities and whatever we're talking about, whether we're talking about jati, biradari, or kul, or whatever indigenous social identity we're talking about, they branched off the questions, specific questions about caste identity, to only Hindus. I spoke to one of the researchers of that study, and they said it was really just expediency, knowing the fact that these types of identities cut across all religious traditions. But regardless, they found when it came to discrimination, less than 5% reported encountering caste-based discrimination. But we have to dig a little bit deeper here. In that 5%, half said that the perpetrator of the alleged discrimination were not of Indian origin, which, even led the survey researchers to kind of question, well, what really was at play? Was it something else? So we know statistically, by the evidence and probably anecdotally, that caste-based discrimination is exceedingly rare. But when I say it's not whether we deal with this issue, but how we deal with it, there are already non-discrimination laws on the books that are broad and what's called facially neutral. What facially neutral means is that these categories don't presume any particular race, any particular national origin, any particular gender to be the perpetrator, and they don't presume the victim. So, and they don't necessarily single out or target any one group.
But isn't that the basis of American jurisprudence?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You cannot assume who the perpetrator is, and you cannot assume who the victim is. You have to look into that, because a perpetrator could come from any community, and a victim could be from any community. But isn't that, you look at all these op-eds, and they're asking for federal laws. They've been successful in Seattle City Council, and now they're asking for federal laws, where they're asking for, you cannot discriminate on the basis of ethnic origin. You cannot discriminate on the base. All that is already in the Constitution. Now they want to include caste as a category there. That is the ultimate aim. That is the ultimate game, that they want to introduce caste as a category of discrimination. And that, to me, presupposes that every Hindu American is a casteist.
Right. So what I would say, I think it's a little bit more layered than that. One is that caste is the single most entrenched stereotype about Indians and Hindus, right? Yeah. So just the concept, I mean, you have states like California where they have 5 bullet points on what needs to be taught about India and Hinduism. One is teach the Aryan invasion. I think we got rid of that over the years, but it used to be teach the Aryan invasion, teach about the caste system, right? So, yeah, and
colonial tropes.
What's that?
I said totally colonial tropes.
Right, exactly. And then there's like the, discuss the advent of Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is portrayed as a rejection of the Hindu evil priesthood, and, right? So it's a reform movement. I mean, honestly, if you look at the way sometimes in which Buddhism or Jainism or even Sikhism is portrayed in contrast to Hinduism, it's actually the story of Protestantism. It's not the story of the Dharmic traditions. However, whether you're looking at the media, whether you're looking at school textbooks, caste is something that is inextricably linked with India and Hinduism. But I'll go a step further. If you look at all of the activism, whether it's Seattle, whether it's any college campus, whether it's now California, South Asians or Indians or specifically Hindus become the subject of all the testimony. They are the subject of all the evidence that is submitted. I mean, some of these places like Seattle, they're submitting reports from India. Well, talk about dual loyalty. What do the realities on the ground in India have to do
with anything here?
With anything here, especially the city of Seattle. So there's no mistake in terms of the facially discriminatory nature of caste, right? As a term. So there it is a departure in that it's presuming, to your point, it's presuming that all people of Indian origin are going to identify by this and therefore discriminate on this, or that a special category that is a departure from all these other facially neutral. So race doesn't associate with just any one group. Race doesn't mean all whites or all blacks. No, it means anyone, right? And all of these are in some sense a social construct. But so race does that. National origin, who are we talking about? You don't just think of, national origin, I'm going to think of a Korean person. No, you think of anyone from somewhere outside of the United States. But when it comes to caste, boom, one prototype that comes to your head. So in that sense, it's a facially discriminatory category. But here's where I think these activists because they are ignorant of the law, or they don't care because they come from a postmodern ideology where it's like break down the system, but then there's not necessarily a solution. So what they have missed is that they have scored a self goal, because while in India there are presumptions inbuilt in the law of presumed oppressor and presumed oppressed, right? When you look at something like the Atrocities Act, there are certain communities that are presumed to be victims and have the protection, and anyone outside of that is presumptively then a perpetrator.
Right.
That's not how American law works. So let's take a category like color, right? Color, you might think, okay, black and white. Well, no. Guess what? There's case law where lighter skinned African Americans may have mistreated someone who's darker skinned, and those things have been litigated under there. There's no presumption of, you know, certain skin tones that are going to be the perpetrator or going to be the victim. So arguably, whether caste is there or not, because we believe that all of the social markers that could be associated with caste, whether it's your birthplace or your jati background or whatever background, biradari, whatever, your birthplace, your descent, you know, your language, your culture, whatever that means, those things are already covered by national origin. The courts have told us that. So this idea of putting in one category that singles out, targets, and basically places a seed of doubt into everyone, because there's only now, this is the departure. No other ethnic or racial community has a category that is only associated with them, but Indians do, and it's 1.5%. But arguably, you know, where I've seen the most vitriol coming out in the United States amongst these activist circles, even those people vehemently opposing these policies, I have never heard a casteist slur coming from those people who are opposing these policies. I have heard demonization coming from the
other side.
Policy, right?
Yeah. So what you are saying, if I break this thing, you are clearly and unambiguously saying that there should be zero discrimination.
Right.
Absolutely no discrimination. And you are saying if there is a discrimination, because there are all kinds of people in the world, if there is a discrimination in a corporate world or in a school or in a university, then there already exist laws that can take care of this. You do not need to have caste-specific laws, because a discrimination is a discrimination. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Any discrimination should be opposed.
Well, exactly. And the other thing is, though, that in amending these laws to add caste, you cannot amend the laws with a category that violates the very law you're trying to amend, right? These laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of national origin, ethnicity, or ancestry, like we're looking at in California. But now you want to add a category that singles out a group on the basis of their national origin, ethnicity, and ancestry, right? So you are essentially violating the very laws that you're seeking to amend.
Right.
That's discrimination.
That's right. Also, then what do you do when there is a discrimination from the supposedly same caste on each other? Then how are you going to handle that kind of situation? Because that happens as well.
Look, so, discrimination is discrimination.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So if you are, it doesn't matter. I mean, even if someone is within the same community, right? And the example that I gave earlier, where there are cases of discrimination happening within, between two African Americans of different shades. This has happened between people of, Hispanic background of different shades, or different ideas of who has more Spanish blood, who has more, indigenous, native, whatever it is, blood. So every ethnic community, every racial community has these notions or perceptions in which it limits their ability to treat people for their inherent worth, right? And the thing is that when you have these broad general categories, it allows us as a country to make a statement to say, listen, we are not going to tolerate discrimination. You need to treat one another fairly, with dignity, and equally, right? So the beauty of these broad categories is that, look, anyone can come forward and be protected against someone's behavior or conduct that is treating you on the basis of these certain protected characteristics: race, gender, ethnicity, age, disability. All of these things are protected against, and we as a society have made those decisions. Has America been perfect? Far from it. But we are an evolving country, and there have been vast improvements. Look at where we are today in contrast to where we might have been in, say, 1960. Very different country. And so these types of challenges are going to continue. If you look, do we need to have separate categories if there's sectarian differences? No. Because if an Ahmadi Muslim is discriminated against by a Sunni or Shia, guess what? It fits under religion. We don't need to give a specific, category to offer them protection. And in that same way, any sort of, and it may not just be quote unquote caste. We've heard cases of linguistic discrimination. Well, that's also covered under national origin or under ethnicity. So, these kind of what seems to be novel incidents are not as novel as one would think. And bottom line is that we still make up only 1% of this country. And now with these types of policies, first of all, even, whether you are you're a self-identified Dalit, or whether you're a self-identified Brahmin, the fact is that these types of policies and all of these headlines have portrayed our entire community, regardless of background, as either a nuisance or a liability. So when it comes down to it, when an employer has a choice in Seattle between hiring someone of Indian or South Asian origin versus someone else, why would I want to hire a South Asian? And all this uncertainty, all of these, these kind of presumptions that, there's so much infighting in that group, infighting that actually doesn't exist, but the narrative has been perpetuated as such. And these activists have also been able to ride the wave of kind of divisive strains and trends that have infected kind of this DEI space. And that's part of the reason why it has exploded.
I have almost reached the end of this, but I just want to ask you something before we close this. I see, but from what I understood after this talking to you, is that you seem to be worried, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be worried, what you seem to be really worried about is that if there is discrimination, if there is prejudice, then there are laws already that need to correct it. If you are going to bring this separate category, what you are saying is that it's not going to help fix that prejudice. It's not going to help fix that discrimination if it comes from that person. It's going to perpetuate it. Instead, what is going to happen now is that there is going to be reverse discrimination on the entire society, of which so-called presumed upper caste, lower caste, everyone will be a victim of. Because suddenly now, because you have to understand, you want only 1% of the population. Now, because everyone is considered a nuisance and everyone is considered troublemakers, now you are trying to say that, look at the broader picture, everyone is going to come out as a loser, or everyone is going to not benefit from this legislation, whether it is the so-called perpetrator or the victim. In the United States, if such a legislation is brought at a federal level, it is the entire community that is going to be at the receiving end, because now they will be discriminated on these presumptions. Is that what the worry is?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, what we need, some of those who have championed this policy have claimed that there were, people within their circles who had faced discrimination, but because caste wasn't a category, they didn't know that they could file a complaint. First, some of the examples that have been given, we have to do some education exactly on what is discrimination. Some of them have been about, well, I brought vegetarian food to a potluck and they had me put it on a separate table. I'm sorry, that's not discrimination. However, discrimination is very clearly defined in terms of harassing consistent patterns of behavior in the workplace that create a hostile environment that are based on, say, your background, or where your background is a reason why you are denied opportunities within the work, you're denied promotions, or you're fired. So there's very clear definitions of what discrimination is, especially in the workplace or public accommodation or wherever else. What we need to do, if there are individuals who have faced discrimination or think that they have faced discrimination, is we need to educate people. If you didn't know, if something happened that was so egregious, but you didn't file a complaint simply because a word was not there, well, then that HR company in your corporation needs to do a better job of educating people on, what the process is, and you have to go file a complaint. I know people who work in HR, they get all sorts of complaints. So, I have to kind of question, like, something happened so egregious and you didn't complain. And if you did complaining, well, then the companies
there are only two cases about caste. There are only two cases, as far as, correct me if I'm wrong, two cases in the American courts right now. One is the Cisco case, and another one is that Temple case. I'm not sure if that has been resolved.
That's not in the courts yet. That was a raid, and so I think
Swaminarayan Temple case. Did it make it to the courts?
No, it has not. In fact, that's the big mystery. Big raid, big headlines, and then radio silence. So
no, so then there is only one case in the court.
There's only one case, and I would encourage people. I'll send you a link. I would encourage people to really dig into this case, because in that particular case,
and we're talking about Swaminarayan Temple case.
No, I'm talking about the Cisco case. So in the Cisco case, first of all, Hindu American Foundation has filed a Section 1983 civil rights claim because the state there has tried to define caste as something that is inherent, caste and discrimination as inherent practices and teachings of the Hindu tradition. Now, the United States, one of the bedrock principles is the separation of church and state, and the First Amendment gives us a guarantee of religious freedom, which means the state cannot define or interfere.
The state cannot say what are the essential practices of a faith.
Exactly, and that's what they've done. But setting that aside, let's look at the facts of this case. So you have Sundar Iyer, who's one of the defendants. He actually recruited this John Doe who self-identifies as a Dalit. If there were any sort of caste animus, or the defendant was a quote unquote casteist, why would he first of all recruit John Doe? Second thing is that John Doe, Sundar Iyer relinquished all of his stock equity. This was kind of a startup within a startup at Cisco, relinquished all his stock equity. And so John Doe got stock grants worth several $1 million. The state claims that he was the only Dalit in this division. But the fact is that there were 3 head positions in this department, and one of them was held by someone else who's a self-identified Dalit, and the other 2 were at different points in time offered to that individual. So if there were, widespread caste discrimination, as opposed to maybe some performance and management issues, why is this case even here, right? They've also identified Sundar Iyer as a Hindu, but he's actually an atheist. He has a blog from back in his days at Stanford where he rejects organized religion. So when you start looking at this case, now we're like 2.5 years in and nothing has moved on this case. So even there, I think that it's what the problem with the Cisco case has been is that it's now, it's been trial by media, but the trial by jury has actually not occurred. And so the Cisco case is oftentimes used as evidence of widespread discrimination, when the fact is that the case is still pending. And then when you dig a little bit deeper into the actual facts of the case, they're kind of on shaky grounds. So, yes, there's only one case.
Other than that, so this must be the only first time in the United States of America, the great democracy that this is, that based on one case which has not been settled, you actually have legislation now, which is a citywide legislation, but it is a legislation nevertheless.
Right.
So they're just based on one case. This is ridiculous.
One case and manipulated data, right? Because
Manipulated
no one cites Carnegie. They
Yeah.
cite the Equality Labs
Yeah.
survey, which first of all just went through their South Asian activist circle, so sample and confirmation bias. They threw out any responses where people didn't identify by caste. So now you have a concentration of people who are probably more caste conscious or want to, have activism around this issue. And they did all sorts of other things in terms of manipulating the data. If someone came from like mixed caste background, they defaulted to whichever was, in their view, the higher caste. Who made them the arbitrators of status? Maybe they had a pyramid chart. I don't know. But the fact is that it is not reliable. It is not generalizable. And yet it's being submitted as evidence. And even, and the Carnegie survey actually makes a point of this, about the unreliability of this activist survey. And yet it's just blindly cited by lawmakers and by the media.
Yeah. So there's so much unawareness sometimes, I think, and also agenda. I would like to end this, Suhag, by quoting a bit from your testimony on April 29, 2021, that you gave in Santa Clara County. I think because it was a public hearing where you and managing director of HAF, Samir Kalra, you were amongst many Hindu American community members who testified, and I went through that testimony, and I would, for the benefit of our audience, I would just like to read a little bit from there. You say, and I quote you, "To those who testified about specific incidents of caste-based discrimination at work and school, such incidents should be brought to light, thoroughly investigated, and rectified. And where they can be rectified is under existing law and by extension, existing county and company policies. The solution to addressing caste-based discrimination is not in the creation of caste as a specific category, but rather enforcing existing laws, educating people of their rights, ensuring companies are compliant with their legal obligations, and cultural competency training as our communities and companies grow increasingly diverse." So you're clearly saying that you are not in favor of caste discrimination. What you want is enforcing current existing laws because you think those are good enough to deal with any kind of discrimination that is sort of filed under caste discrimination, caste discrimination as well. So it's very important to bring out that point that Hindu Americans are not in favor of any discrimination. No, it's not just Hindu American. No sane mind in 2023 will approve of any discrimination. The point is, how do we fix that? If there is discrimination, if there is prejudice, there will always be prejudiced minds. There will always be some sort of discrimination or another. We're not a perfect society. We never will be a perfect society. But then we have laws, at least in United States, there are at least on paper, there are laws that can fix this. There is need to enforce those laws. There is need for educating people about the diversity and about the complexities of other people, and not form these blanket legislations and not go into these blanket statements like caste is an inherent part of Hinduism, or all Hindus are castes. I am from a community in, as you well know, Suhag, from Kashmir, and my family and with me, scores of Kashmiri Pandits were thrown out of our house. We've gone through a genocide. We happen to identify as Brahmins. I didn't see any Brahmin privilege in my life when we were thrown out of our homes. So these complexities need to be talked about. These complexities need to be understood, and these complexities need to be part of this legislation. I don't worry about activists. Their job is activism. They don't want anything to be resolved, because if anything is resolved, what will they do with their
They'll be out of a job.
They have nothing to. So I don't worry about that. But our lawmakers, they are responsible people. They should take into all sides of debate into account before they actually get into the serious business of lawmaking, because that is important. And America has always stood for equality, and America has always stood for fairness. And I think if these caste-based legislations find their way into more city laws, or God forbid, federal laws, then the promise of America to Indian Americans and to Hindu Americans is being lost and is being compromised upon. On that note, thank you, Suhag, for educating us. Thank you so much for being here. I haven't touched upon, I have had tons of, my phone is buzzing. I have had more questions for you. So we have to do a part 2.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'll just say one last thing.
Please go ahead.
That is that, yes, this is a kind of divisive direction that feels like a tide. But the other American thing is that we can fight for our rights. And that's what we're doing at HAF. And we've gone to the courts, and we'll go to the courts again. So, in order to protect the rights of not just Hindu Americans, but all Americans.
Exactly. And to everyone who's watching this show, I would request you to go to HAF website. It is a very well curated website. If you don't have time to go through all the newspaper articles and sort of find everything about, they've done an excellent job of not only explaining what their advocacy is, but also talking about the issues. So it would be wonderful if you go to haf.org, and sort of educate yourself before you get into these contentious debates. Thank you for being here with us, Suhag, and we will get back with you soon, and we have to have a part 2 of this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. It was great.
To my audience, if you like the conversations that we have here, if you like these elephant in the room conversations, then do subscribe to Epilogue News Network, and there's where you'll find information about Epicentre, our new guests, and all kinds of topics that we talk about, varied topics that we talk about. Our next conversation is going to be equally scintillating. I am not going to tell you who the other guest is, but it is going to be as scintillating and as interesting and as thought-provoking. On that note, this is Sunanda Vashisht signing off. See you next time.